right, good afternoon and welcome to Books and Books. My name is Ketsia and I'm part of the events department right here. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon and thank you for the internet audience for tuning in. You're all in for a great informative presentation today and you can keep up with all our events online. And for those of you who are here, you can pick up a calendar, which we have set aside at the register. And for those of you watching, you can look at our internet website. It's www.booksandbooks.com and you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Those of you online, if you'd like to purchase a book and have it personalized by Mr. Kleinberg, call the number on your screen and we will ship it to you for free wherever you are in the U.S. during the program. We look forward to hearing from you. So a little bit about our book presentation. A very interesting historical basis of hurricane history in Florida. In September 1928, when great storms were still unnamed, nearly 700 Black men, women, and children were buried in unmarked West Palm Beach ditch following the nation's second deadliest hurricane. The savage gust that churned the waters of Lake Okeechobee into a maelstrom of death afflicted victims of all races and classes and produced tales of survival and loss among whites and blacks alike. The vast majority of the post-storm workers were poor Black migrants. Even if the hurricane was colorblind, the recovery and rebuilding efforts were not. Mr. Kleinberg details the storm's track, the failure to properly predict landfall, personal battles against nature's wrath, and the extraordinary suffering of Black citizenry forced to provide disproportionate amount of rebuilding and labor and endure the burial of friends and family in unmarked pits. Mr. Kleinberg tells a powerful story of man versus nature and man versus man. Now, a little bit about our author. Elliot Kleinberg was born and raised in South Florida, as seen in his education. Elliot graduated from Miami area public schools and received 2 degrees from the University of Florida. Go Gators, I'm a Gator. He has spent some 4 decades working in both broadcast and print news, including in his early 30 years at the Palm Beach Post in West Palm Beach. In addition to covering local news for the Post, he also writes extensively about Florida and Floridiana. He has published 10 books, and to list a few, we have 2 Weird Florida books, and Palm Beach Past and Wicked Palm Beach, both collections of his weekly local history columns in the Post that's run for about a dozen years, so that's a great accomplishment. He is also a member of the Florida, South Florida, and Palm Beach County Historical Societies. Elliot and his wife, Deborah, are parents of 2 adult sons and live in Casa Floridiana in Boca Raton, Florida. So now let's give a very nice, warm Books and Books welcome to Mr. Elliot Kleinberg.
Thanks. Welcome to South Florida. I know it's hot, but the trade-off is it's not 20 below in January. Am I on? Okay. It's a pleasure to be in Coral Gables, where actually I was born. I'm a proud Gator who was born across the street from the University of Miami. It's always nice to be down in Miami with my dad, who ran the Miami News for many years. I know how pretentious it is for authors who read from their books, but I'm going to do it anyhow. The bracelet caught Festus Stallings' eye. It was on another of the corpses, all of them bloated and discolored from days in standing water and merciless sun that stole their identities and reduced them to lost debris. Stallings reached and closed his hand around the bauble. It was on the arm of a little girl. A month earlier, she had proudly shown him the bracelet, a gift for her 2nd birthday. He grabbed her by that arm, lifted her up, and added her to the pile of death. The fire whooshed. The workers stepped back, staggered by the burst of heat and the smell of gasoline and burning flesh. A thick, oily cloud of smoke rose. It rose above the muck, above the bent sugar cane and tattered vegetable stalks, above the scattered sticks that had once been homes, above the Great Lake, into the Florida sky. It was a black cloud. So, the second deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States happened right here in South Florida, and you never heard about it. Now, why is that? Well, people always say that. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, let me explain why it's the second biggest natural disaster in the history of the United States and my argument, the most underreported natural disaster in the history of the United States. It killed more people than Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. It killed more people than the San Francisco earthquake. It killed more people than the Johnstown flood. It killed many more people than Andrew. It killed more people than Katrina, and it killed more people than the events of September 11th, 2001. In fact, it killed more people than any single event on any single day, with the exception of the great Galveston, Texas hurricane of 1900, which I will gladly concede because it killed 6,000 to 8,000 people. I'm very glad to be second. But it killed probably 3,000 people, 3,000 Floridians. Now, why is it so underreported? Well, timing is everything. Everybody knows about the 1926 hurricane because it hit a big city, Miami. After the 1928 hurricane, we had the stock market crash, the Depression, World War II, and we were off and running. But probably the biggest reason why this hurricane didn't get the attention it deserved is, and I say it right in the front of my book, if it had drowned 3,000 white people in downtown West Palm Beach, or if it would have smashed a black tie affair out on Palm Beach, they would still be talking about it. But it killed mostly poor black migrant workers, many of whom were from the Deep South, most of whom were from the Deep South or the Caribbean. In many cases, the boss didn't even know their last name. Their loved ones knew they were somewhere in Florida but didn't know where. In many cases, they never found out the fate of their loved ones. They couldn't come to Florida to find out. And when the storm had passed and people realized that they had to get rid of all these bodies because they had a tremendous health disaster on their hand, some of them were moved into areas where they were, let me see if this works, there you go, where they were piled up into big funeral pyres, like the little girl I mentioned at the beginning, and burned, or buried in makeshift cemeteries, 10 or 20 or 30 at a time. By the way, the funeral pyres is one of the reasons why I called the book Black Cloud. Black Cloud is in this horrific imagery. Black Cloud is in a hurricane. Black Cloud is in the impending disaster. And Black Cloud, of course, with the magic word black. Because when they took the bodies out of the standing water in the glades and brought them to the coast and put them in mass graves, about 80 white victims were placed in a mass grave in Woodlawn Cemetery, the West Palm Beach City Cemetery, and loved ones were given the opportunity to try to identify them, to tag them, and they were put into the mass grave with great ceremony. The 674 black victims that were brought to the coast were taken to a spot in downtown West Palm Beach, or just west of downtown West Palm Beach, where a big hole was dug and they were thrown in and covered up. That's not even the worst of it, because everyone can agree that the health concerns required mass graves. And in fact, I remember my editor, when the book first came out, it was originally published in 2003 for the storm's 75th anniversary. I remember my publisher up in New York got on the phone with me and he says, who made the decision to put all the whites in one grave and all the blacks in the other? I said, Phil, you must have been asleep in history class. We can't imagine this now, but in the 1920s, Florida was in the Deep South, and segregation was the rule. And nobody would have ever imagined mixing white and black bodies, including the blacks. It's just, that's the way it was done in 1928. But the tragedy is that that grave was left unmarked for 70 years. Now, a few years ago, I took my kids to Gettysburg, and in Gettysburg, you can't go 10 feet without finding some marker where some guy twisted his ankle. But here's a spot in West Palm Beach that contains 674 human beings. And not just 674 human beings, but 674 victims of the second deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history that you never heard of. So, let's talk about the 1928 hurricane. Well, first of all, when people think about the 1928 hurricane, here's what they think of. This poor man's yacht washed up on the seawall in Palm Beach. He had a tough day. His yacht was damaged. But this is really the story of the 1928 hurricane. These are coffins in which bodies were loaded up to put them into the mass graves. Now, this is a statue. If you're ever out in Belglade, I remember one of my colleagues at the Palm Beach Post, where I worked for 29 years, said he wanted to do a story on here in Florida, where does the South begin? We can all agree now that Florida by far is the most northern of the southern states. In fact, in Florida, the joke is the further north you go, the further south you get. And the further south you go, the further north you get. So he said, well, Elliot, where does the South begin? Does it begin in Ocala? Does it begin in north of Orlando? I said, Ron, the South begins about halfway between West Palm Beach and Belgrade. It's a place called 20 Mile Bend where State Road 80 makes a little bit of a jog. I said, that's where the South begins. Because if you've been to those towns around the southeast corner of Lake Okeechobee, that's the South, even today. And it certainly was in 1928. This statue stands in front of the county library. It was a sculpture that was done in the 70s. And it's actually quite dramatic in its depiction of the horror that was that storm. Because if you were in the glades that night, you've heard the cliche, there was nowhere to run. But this was the case. The water there got up probably around 20 feet above sea level. So, before we can understand how this hurricane did the damage it did, we have to go back even further to this guy. Does anybody know who he is? Yes, Broward. County got named after him. Mr. Broward got himself elected governor on a promise to drain the Everglades. Because if we drained the Everglades, what would be released would be the most fabulous farming soil in the world, and we could get all these farmers to come down here and grow things in this fabulous soil and put lettuce on the tables of people in New Jersey in January. Now, there are a few things. Number one, we know now, 100 years later, that that muck eventually dries up and blows away. So sometime in my grandchildren's lifetimes, there will be a 700,000-acre limestone parking lot in western Palm Beach County. I guess they can play hockey there. There's actually a science station where they have a pole that shows how much of the muck has blown away. In addition, a guy named Stoneman, who ran the editorial page of the Miami Herald, you might have heard of his daughter, who married a guy named Douglas, lived about a couple miles from here. Mr. Stoneman was writing editorials in 1900 saying, might not be a good idea to drain the Everglades. We might be messing with the rain machine. We might be causing problems with the natural flow of rain and water and evaporation and nature, and we might be messing with something that someone else invented that maybe we shouldn't be messing with. But, of course, nobody listened to Mr. Stoneman or any of the other people who were drawing these alarming predictions, because everybody in Florida at the time had stars in their eyes. Well, not exactly stars. What did they have in their eyes? You better believe it, dollar signs. So they drained the Everglades right up to the lake. Now, I always ask people when I do my talks about Lake Okeechobee, does anybody know what was there? We all know where those sugar fields are now. If you ever drive out there, the 700,000 acres of sugar fields. It's staggering, the size of the sugar fields. But you know what was there before the sugar fields? The Everglades. And in fact, there was this magical machine in which water came down from Central Florida, before there was a Cinderella Castle there, down into the lake and through the lake and out the other end of the lake and down through the middle of the state through all this marshland where it was naturally filtered, and down all the way to Florida Bay where all this wonderfully filtered water mixed with salt water and created just the right balance of brackish water that allowed things like lobsters to grow. And everything was doing fine. But, of course, it doesn't look like that now, does it? So, Mr. Broward said, let's drain the Everglades and allow farmers to grow around the lake. Well, these mom-and-pop farmers showed up. This is long before the sugar fields. And the mom-and-pop farmers got there, and they discovered a bit of a problem. And here was the problem. When you get home tonight, just for fun, take a frying pan, fill it with water, and try to walk across your kitchen floor without sloshing any of the water. It ain't going to happen. Lake Okeechobee at its deepest point is about 20 feet deep, and it's 3/4 of the size of Rhode Island. All that water has to go somewhere. And when there's a wind event over the lake sloshes. In fact, there was a rain event about 8 years ago, or a wind event rather, where the north end of the lake was 8 feet higher than the south end of the lake. Well, that wasn't an emergency for anybody for reasons we're going to explain in a minute. The main one being that there's something holding all that water in. Everybody talks about history being in the abstract. If you go up to Lake Okeechobee, the reason you cannot see the lake The reason there's that huge mound around the lake is because of this hurricane. So if you want to talk about history being in the abstract, that's not the case. Here's the lake, 1920s. All these farmers are coming in, and they're building around the lake in what used to be swampland but has now been exposed farmland. And they complain, and they said, look, every time we get a heavy rain or a wind event, all that water oozes out of the south end of the lake and floods our farms. So the government said, no problem. We've got it fixed. They put together a 6-foot-high dike made out of muck and clay, like a little 10-year-old with Play-Doh, just pushed it up there. And they said, well, this will hold in the lake. This will hold in a body of water with about 3 trillion gallons. That's 3/4 the size of Rhode Island. And the farmers were like, okay. So they continued to farm. Something happened in 1926 that you might have heard of if you're familiar with Miami history. But what a lot of people don't remember is that after the 1926 hurricane flattened Miami, it went up to the middle of the state and went to the south shore of Lake Okeechobee, where it encountered this little 6-foot muck dike. Who won? Exactly. So the southwest corner of the muck dike got washed away. Water flooded downtown Moorhaven, which was a decent-sized town then because the commerce around the lake, and drowned 600 people. So the people running the state of Florida were in a dilemma. They said, what do you want to do? We have 2 options. One is we can abandon the interior back to nature. We can concede that nature has defeated civilization and give up. How many times in the history of man has that happened? Never. So the other option was we aren't going to allow this 6-foot dike. That's not going to cut it. We need a big dike. So they had a committee, and they sat down and discussed how to do the committee and the subcommittee. And Miami-Dade said, we feel like we're paying too disproportionate a share. Something's never changed. And somebody said, don't you think we should kind of get going on this? What if there's another hurricane? What are the odds of a hurricane hitting the same place 2 years apart, right? Well, up in Palm Beach County, I watched 2 hurricanes come over my house 3 weeks apart in 2004. But the people in 1926, as they were with almost everything else, were a bit cocky. So they were still arguing about this dike 28 years or 2 years later. So here comes the hurricane. Now keep in mind that this hurricane was around for 3 days before people even knew it existed. I know that's hard to believe now. You know, nowadays we can see them when they come off the coast of Africa. There were no satellites in 1928. So a ship somewhere east of Barbados telegraphed to shore or contacted shore and said, there's something out here. And the captain wrote in his log, the wind freshened, which is one of my wonderful nautical understatement. So now they knew there's a hurricane out there. And they don't know, they have a rough idea of how busy it is or how big it is, how strong it is. And now it's coming through these little islands. Well, all those little islands in the Eastern Caribbean, the fact that they're little islands is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because they're a very tiny target. The chances are great that the hurricane's not going to hit it because they're just this little dot in the middle of the ocean. The bad part is if they do get hit, they get clobbered because it's a little tiny island. There's no place to go. So all these little islands, Barbados and Martinique and Guadeloupe, just got trashed. Lots of people were killed. Then the hurricane set its sights on Puerto Rico. Now, I always say that if the hurricane had died after striking Puerto Rico, people would have written books about the catastrophic Puerto Rico hurricane of 1928. If you are familiar with Puerto Rico, it's basically a spine and everything goes downhill from the middle. So when there's a heavy rainstorm, very bad. Same problem that Haiti has, and Dominican Republic for that matter. So this hurricane came in and went right up the spine, east to west. The official death toll in Puerto Rico was 600 people. Probably was closer to 1,200 or 1,300. A lot of people, remember, this is 1928. Puerto Rico had only been in American possession for about 25 years or so, or 30 years. It was still a very poor country. A lot of people lived literally in shacks that were made of sheets of tin or zinc, which all went flying during the hurricane and literally cut people into pieces. So the death toll was probably closer to 1,200 or 1,300. Keep in mind that those were all Americans. So this hurricane has already killed between 600 and 13 Americans, and it's still in the islands. The next time a hurricane comes through, and this is completely unscientific, and sometimes I'm wrong, but and I know it's almost like a wives' tale, but I have found that if you see a hurricane in the Caribbean, watch what it does to Puerto Rico. If it comes in north of Puerto Rico, there's a real good chance it's going to make that magical curve that they all make and send them up to Bermuda and up into the North Atlantic Ocean where the cold water wears them out, and flowery reporters write that they race to their death in the chilly waters of the North Atlantic. I would never do that. But if they come in south of Puerto Rico, a lot of times they come in under there, they go over to the Yucatan, or they fizzle, or they hit Haiti or the Dominican Republic, where those huge mountains have the effect on the hurricane of sticking a crowbar in a bicycle's wheel. Many, many times Haiti has died for us, more times than we will ever know. If a hurricane hits the mountains of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which are the tallest mountains in the Caribbean, 9 times out of 10, it's going to either wipe out the hurricane or weaken it so much that it's not going to be a factor for us. Now, it is a factor for the people in Haiti. If you guys have ever seen what a hurricane does to Haiti, it's pretty bad. So, but if the hurricane comes right into Puerto Rico, keep an eye on it. And that's what this thing did. It came off the northwest corner of Puerto Rico, and it aimed right at us. Right at us. Now, today's hurricane forecasters have a lot of tools that their counterparts in the 20s did not have. Computers and planes and all sorts of instruments that they can drop into the storm from an airplane and satellites and everything else. Another thing they had that their 1928 counterparts did not have is humility. You might recall that even as Andrew was an hour from landfall, the Hurricane Center was still saying, well, somewhere between Vero Beach and Key West. Now, why did they do that? Because hurricanes sometimes do funny things. For example, I was sitting in Boca Raton at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, and everybody was saying that Boca Raton was going to get Andrew. And instead it hit 80 miles away in Homestead. Charlie was going towards Tampa, and it hit Port Charlotte. And everybody screamed and yelled and said, how could the forecasters have missed their forecast? They were off by 200 miles. No, they were off by 20 miles. The 20-mile difference between staying offshore and continuing on towards Tampa Bay versus angling in and leveling Port Charlotte, which it did. But in 1928, the Weather Service said, this storm will not hit Florida. And they were still saying it until around Saturday night, and the storm hit Sunday afternoon. Around dinner time Saturday night, the Weather Service put out an advisory that said, I love this, recurve not yet indicated. And what they meant by that is that magical curve that those all hurricanes always take might not happen while the hurricane is still out in the ocean. It might happen somewhere around Sebring, which is what it did. So then you get the whole thing, oh, everybody in the hurricane of 28 was killed because of the false forecast. They didn't think the hurricane was going to come. They were caught off guard. Well, first of all, we know that's not the case. And also, if you read Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is the great Zora Neale Hurston novel, it's a fabulous book, and the hurricane in it is this hurricane. She wasn't in it, but she lived in Bill Glade before the hurricane. She was in the islands when the hurricane hit. She came back and talked to people. She takes some liberties. She gives the hurricane 200-mile-an-hour winds, which ain't going to happen. She had the lake creating a giant tidal wave, which is not exactly how it happened. She also said that the Seminoles, there's a part in the book where the Seminoles are like, oh, big storm coming. The sawgrass is blooming. So they know a storm's coming. Well, first of all, some Seminoles drowned in the 1928 hurricane. So much for that. Secondly, the Seminoles weren't the only ones that knew that the storm was coming. It's on the front page of the newspaper that the storm was coming. And even though the hurricane people were saying, or there was no hurricane center, the weather people were saying it's not going to hit Florida, a lot of people were like, well, it might, and we better get ready just in case. In order for people to have been lulled by the false forecast, they would have had to have heard the false forecast. This is 1928. I've been in the newspaper business for 40 years, and my dad before me will be the first to admit a newspaper is only as good as what was happening about 14 hours ago. So when the hurricane landed in people's driveways on that Sunday morning, they were reporting what they'd been told by the Weather Service at about 9 o'clock the night before. And by 10 o'clock Sunday morning, the winds were already starting to pick up. Did CNN report it in 1928? No, they did not. Was there a TV in 1928? Nope. Were there radios? Yeah, but how many people had one in 1928? Then the people in the Glades, even if they knew that a killer hurricane was coming and might drown them, what were their options? Well, there were only 3 ways out of the southeast corner of Lake Okeechobee, really just 2. The first one wasn't ready yet, which was Highway 27 out to Fort Myers. They were first building the roadbed. Those of you who have grown up in South Florida know that you cannot build a road in Florida until you build a raised roadbed. Otherwise, the road will be underwater all the time. And all those canals that crisscross South Florida, many of those canals are fill canals, where they took the dirt out to make the raised roadbed, put in water, and they have all these canals where everybody drives their car into them and drowns. So 27 wasn't finished yet. They hadn't even finished building the raised roadbed. Highway 98 is a 2-lane road that follows the east side of Lake Okeechobee. I was on it about 3 months ago. It's still a slow ride. The only other way out of the southeast corner of the lake was towards the coast, to West Palm. Well, who was going to go there? And all of this presumes that if you're a poor black migrant worker in 1928 living in the Glades, what do you probably not have? A car. So those people had nowhere to go, and not just the blacks either. Many of the farmers out there were poor whites who didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and a car was a tremendous luxury in 1928. So they said, you know what, we're just going to have to tough it out and pray for the best. So they got in their houses, they had dinner, they waited for the hurricane to hit. People say, well, how could the hurricane do this kind of damage? By the way, that's my newspaper. It was the only day they didn't publish, was the day after the hurricane. But you can see why. They had a pretty good excuse. How could the hurricane do that kind of damage on the coast? Wouldn't it lose punch in the 40 miles between the coast and the lake? And the answer is no, not really. Think about how humongous a hurricane is. How much is it going to really lose punch across 40 miles? That's just a couple of hours. And oh, by the way, it was passing across swampland. Now, how big was this hurricane? Well, I was doing a talk while I was working on the book originally in 2002, and I said, well, most people believe the eye was about as far south as Lake Worth. And a lady raised her hand. She said, excuse me, I know for a fact that hurricane eye was all the way as far south as Boynton Beach. So if you guys are familiar with Palm Beach County, it's Lake Worth, Lantana, Boynton Beach, Delray, Boca. She goes, no, that eye was all the way in Boynton Beach. I didn't have to ask her how she knew, but I made sure to get her name and interviewed her for the book, and she's in there. They were in the eye. The Delray Beach Fire Department history page has people describing the eye. So the eye was stretched from Delray Beach to Riviera Beach. That's about a 22-mile eye. Andrew's eye was about 15 miles. Charlie's eye over in Port Charlotte was about 11 miles. So this 1928 hurricane was a huge, huge hurricane. It blew out windows in Vero Beach, and it blew out windows here in Miami. And in fact, the great Jupiter Lighthouse, which was built by Meade, the guy who went on to Gettysburg, was said to have swayed several inches from side to side while the mortar squeezed out from between the bricks of the lighthouse like toothpaste. How'd you like to have been in there during the 28 hurricane? Then it hit the lake. When I was working on the book, I talked at length to these guys from the Hurricane Center who were wonderful. And they walked me through the science of how this storm did what it did. Everybody says the storm was coming from the east, from the coast. Why did it wash the water out of the lake? Well, we all know that a storm is basically a gigantic cyclone. It's a gigantic tornado. And as the storm came in, it was moving counterclockwise, as they all do. And the north end of the storm was up around the north end of the lake. So this fellow from the Hurricane Center says, had it been daylight, you would have seen fish flopping around on the lake bed at the north end of the lake up here near the town of Okeechobee. Because as the storm came in, it took all those probably 145-mile-an-hour winds sustained. And it took all that water. Remember I told you it's only 20 feet deep. It's got to go somewhere. 3/4 the size of Rhode Island, and washed it all down to the only place where there were people. How did that muck dike do? Not very good. This chart shows the extent of the flooding. It's hard to get the pure horror of it from a map because there were people there. And there were engineers that came in and saw water lines on the buildings in downtown Belgrade of 20 feet above sea level. I had first-person accounts. I actually interviewed people because I first started writing about this hurricane back in 1988 for the 60th anniversary. And I interviewed people who, within 10 years, had died of old age. And something told me to hold on to my notes. I also watched 14 hours of oral histories that these people gave to students at Palm Beach State College Belgrade campus. My friends at work said, "You're going to listen to 14 hours of people talking about the hurricane?" Yeah. They talk about being in their house and the water starts coming in under the door jamb. And then it starts getting up to their ankles. And then somebody says, "We better get up on the dining table." Now, this is not some horror movie. This is real, and it happened to real people in our state. And I've talked to people whose grandparents are great. When the book first came out, I did a talk in Belgrade, and people were in line to buy the book. And as they would come up, they would say, "My great uncle is on page 87." This is real people. So they're in there, and the water's coming up, and they're like, "Oh, we better get up on the dining table." And then the water's in the dining table. And then they're like, "Oh, we better get up in the attic." And then the water's in the attic. And now there's only one thing to do, which is punch a hole in the roof. And Uncle John punches a hole in the roof, and he's gone. This really happened. I mean, I was writing this stuff in for the book, and I'd like have to go get up and walk around and get a glass of cold water. So the morning after the hurricane, that's what it looked like. And that's what it looked like. There was a guy named Vernon Boots. Remember I mentioned to you about the Highway 27 roadbed? His parents had come down from Central Florida to work on that Highway 27 roadbed. And their house was about 300 yards from the roadbed. And Vernie told me, actually, he told me, and he also told a class, I watched the videotape, that his house came up off its foundation and began floating, which houses are not supposed to do. And it floated, and it hit that roadbed. And it bounced off, hit it a second time, bounced off, hit it a third time, and came apart like a house of cards. Vernie somehow managed to grab a joist with some drywall attached to it and clung to that for 6 hours all night in 20-foot waves, except they were waves over sugar fields, in 144-mile-an-hour winds, screaming for his family. He was 14. Screaming and screaming and screaming, and nobody could hear him, and he couldn't hear anybody. Finally, sometime around before sunrise, he somehow managed to doze off. The winds had died down. He woke up. It was broad daylight. He's telling the story. And he started screaming and screaming, and he heard a voice, and it was his older brother. And at this point, Vernie has to stop. He's so choked. Not when he was describing what the hurricane did to his family, but at this spot, he had to stop. And you can hear all the college kids squirming in their seats, and you hear the teacher saying, "Now, Vernie, take your time, take your time." And the reason he was so choked with emotion is that he recalled being 14 years old and having gone through this horrific hurricane and hearing his brother's voice and realizing that he was not the last person alive on the planet. And I don't know how you live with that. I don't know how you ever get that out of your head, and he never did. So, all this damage is out in the glades, but nobody knows it. Anybody know who this guy is with the smiling face? That's Governor Martin. He was the governor at the time. He was already a lame duck because he was running for Senate unsuccessfully. A bunch of businessmen north of West Palm Beach wanted to create a new county between Palm Beach County and St. Lucie County, and the state legislature was taking its sweet time. So they went up there and they said, "Governor Martin, if you'll help us push this through, we'll name the county after you." So Governor Martin gets his cabinet together. He goes, that hurricane was pretty bad down there. How bad was it? Well, we're not sure. This is before TV, radio. Well, we think it was pretty bad. We keep hearing stuff from the glades, but we're not sure from the interior. Well, get some people down. This is like 3 days later. So they finally got people down there, and this is what they found. And that's some of the pictures that I can use. There was a health and environmental catastrophe. You guys have been here in the heat of the summer When something's dead in standing water, you know what I mean. It wasn't just people. It was cows and snakes and rotting vegetation. And they were terrified of epidemics. So, like I said, they did the burials. And here's the mass burial site in 1928. That sign didn't go up until 2000, almost 75 years after the storm. For most of that time, there was nothing there. So people say, well, have we learned the lessons of the 1928 hurricane? Well, I say we haven't learned the lessons of the last hurricane. How many people were totally unprepared for this guy? How did Andrew kill only 15 people? But this hurricane that I'm writing about killed, well, the official death toll was 1,836. In 2003, the National Hurricane Center changed the number to 2,500 in time for the 75th anniversary, not as the result of any new research, but simply an acknowledgement that that 1,800 number was wrong. I go with about 3,000. How did this hurricane kill 3,000 when Andrew only killed 15 people? What's the magic word? Water. There was a tropical storm in 1998 called Mitch. It drowned 10,000 people in Central America. I asked Max Mayfield, you remember him, National Hurricane Center director. I said, Max, how many people would Mitch have killed in Florida? You know what he said? 0. Because all that water, all that rain hit Central America and caused mudslides, and people were living in tin shacks and got washed down the side of the hill. So, what's the biggest killer in a hurricane? It's water. It's not even close. So, everybody worried so much about Andrew, but you did okay, didn't you? I mean, financially, buildings were smashed. Everybody was psychologically scarred, but we survived. But here's 3,000 people that drowned in Lake Okeechobee. What are we going to do about it? Well, we know what we did. We built a dike. We built a dike that cost millions and millions of dollars and took 40 years to finish. Oh, and by the way, the dike leaks. I've been out there myself. It doesn't leak. It's not like, first of all, if you've been out there, it's not like a wall. It's this big mound. And the pressure of the water is not at the top. The pressure is at the bottom. That's where the dikes failed in New Orleans as well. And if you go out on the dike, there are places you can go where you can see water percolating up through the dirt and the gravel. That's bad. That's the lake that's percolating up. In addition, there are 2 spots where the lake goes out to the coast. The St. Lucie Canal that goes up to the Treasure Coast and the Caloosahatchee, which goes out to Fort Myers. And in those 2 spots, those are the lake's most weakest spots, most vulnerable spots. Because if there's a hurricane, do you think those metal gates are going to hold in a lake the size of 3/4 the size of Rhode Island? So the Corps of Engineers says, when we get a lot of rain and the lake gets to a certain level, we're worried about the dike holding it. So what do? It's been in the news for the last 3 weeks. They let the water out. And how do they let the water out? They send it down those canals down to Fort Myers and down to St. Lucie, the St. Lucie Inlet. Here's the problem. Both of those places end in estuaries. Remember what I told you about Florida Bay? These estuaries are places where nature has magically balanced fresh and salt water so that all these little animals and vegetation can live and grow and thrive and become part of the natural ecosystem. And if you mess with that balance, bad things happen. And I'm sure you guys have been watching the news for the last 3 weeks because there's an algae bloom there that is all over Stewart, which is a resort, fishing, charter boating. That's their economy. They're dead in the water, literally. I stood next to that algae. I was standing next to Bill Nelson, senator, about 2 weeks ago. The stink was so bad that you just wanted to run away. It smelled like if you've ever had a bag of lettuce in your refrigerator in college that you forgot about, and you found it 6 months later. Well, multiply that times 10,000, and you get an idea. And that's people's livelihoods. So they're telling the Corps, quit sending this water down the St. Lucie where we're getting this algae bloom. And the Corps says, well, we have to do something with the water because we don't trust the dike. So remember when I told you about history being an abstraction? Not really. So once again, have we learned the lessons of the 28 hurricane? Well, here's an interesting graphic that we did for the paper. See all those hurricanes that struck before 1944? And see how many struck between 1944 and 2000. by coincidence, or maybe not, what was happening in Florida during that 50-year period where they didn't get any hurricanes? The population went from 2 million to 14 million. Okay, you following a trend here? So now we had Andrew, and then we went a long time without hurricanes. Then we had all these hurricanes in 04 and 05. And folks, I got bad news for you. Did you notice? We haven't had a hurricane since, have we? That's 11 years. Well, here's the hurricanes we had in 04 and 05. They were all over the place, weren't they? But nothing since. So that means if you were 18 years old when Wilma struck in 2005, you're now 29 years old, maybe with a house, maybe with kids. You were a teenager when Wilma hit. You're now a householder with property to protect. Your memories of Wilma and Katrina, which, by the way, came through her, you might recall, your memories might be a little shaky. And you've gone now 11 years. Hurricanes are off the radar, you know? Dwayne Wade, hockey, who's going to be governor? Oh, and by the way, we haven't had a hurricane in 11 years. I don't have to tell you that the hurricane people and the emergency management people are scared to death. Oh, and by the way, of the people that were here in 2005, what about the people who were not here in 2005 because they moved here from Brooklyn or Idaho, where they've never seen anything like a hurricane, or they weren't born yet, or they were 3 years old? What's going to happen when the next hurricane comes? There won't be another hurricane. We're done with hurricanes. No? You don't think so? When Francis hit in 2004, we sent reporters out to a home improvement center when the storm was 48 hours away. Now, at the time, I was putting together the hurricane preparation guide, which we put in the paper every year on Memorial Day. They told you how to measure your window for plywood, how many cans of soup to get, how much water to get, should you evacuate. By the way, 99% of the time you should not evacuate. You evacuate for water. If you're not in a flood zone, you're much better off in your house. If you try to leave, you're going to end up on the interstate when the storm hits. Or everybody says, oh, let's go to Orlando. Well, 3 of the 4 hurricanes in 2004 hit Orlando. So with 48 hours to go before Francis, all these people were in the parking lot of this home improvement center at 5 o'clock in the morning with a clipboard and a pencil and a notepad and a measuring tape, asking the home improvement guy, what do I do now? And you're looking at him and you're like, didn't you save that thing we gave you in May that told you what to do? Well, of course not. Well, at least now, and then Francis hit and it was terrible. It was a mess. There was all sorts of damage. Now people have got the message. 3 weeks later, 3 weeks, Gene is threatening the same part of Florida. And we go out to the home improvement center. Same people. So the hurricane people are very, very nervous, and the emergency management people are very, very nervous. We have an advantage that our counterparts in the earthquake zones and the tornado zones do not have, which is we can see it coming. So what is our excuse? We have no excuse. If your house is properly built, if you have window coverings, and if you're not in a flood zone where you're going to get hit by a storm surge, you will survive the hurricane. So why aren't you doing that? Many, many, many of the deaths that will happen in the next hurricane, and there will be deaths, unfortunately, will be preventable deaths. And that's the lesson of hurricanes, preparation. And the lesson of the 1928 hurricanes is water, water, water. And proper communication and proper preparation and knowing your limitations. And by the way, treating black people the same as white people and not throwing them in a mass grave or conscripting them against their will without paying them to do cleanup or shooting them in the back when they give you lip, all of which are in my book. So I've covered a lot of material. I've talked too long. I hope I've taught you a little bit about this storm, because I dare say that most people, I'm up in Palm Beach County, most people in Palm Beach County have never heard of this hurricane. But it's a real hurricane, and it could, to some extent, be repeated with catastrophic effects. So I've covered a lot of material. I've got a few minutes for questions or comments. I'll repeat your question because I know they're live streaming it. Yes, sir. The question is what's now at the spot where the mass grave in West Palm Beach to the nearly 700 black victims, and what finally prompted officials to finally do something about it. As I said, for about 70 years, this mass grave was completely unmarked. It was in the black neighborhood of West Palm Beach. These people were invisible. I mean, let's be honest. At one point in the 60s, part of the street at the north end of the mass grave was rerouted so that the street is on top of part of the mass grave. Sometime in the mid 1990s, an educator by the name of Robert Hazard and a couple of other guys got together. He had moved down from New England to work for a charter school in Palm Beach County, and he was at a party and he heard of all this and he said, "What's at the mass grave now?" They said, "Nothing." So he said, "That's ridiculous." So he got involved. Some other people got involved. They started complaining to the city of West Palm Beach, which didn't own the property. The property had changed hands. People had actually bought the property without knowing that it covered a mass grave, which is pretty amazing. And the city finally, around 2000, bought the property from the fellow who owned it. He gave it to them at a very reasonable deal. And now there's a wrought iron gate that surrounds the mass grave. It's a park. It's been, improved into a park with pathways and benches. There's several historical markers. Every few years, I have to write a story about how it's fallen into disrepair. And then after my story runs, it magically gets cleaned up. And many, many people have gone there. Mr. Hazard and some of his other friends, what they really envisioned, and I talk about it in the book, was a massive educational center where people could go and learn about hurricanes and learn about nature, learn about the black experience in South Florida in the 20s, the entire farming agriculture experience, which is really a subject that really people down here don't really appreciate. All the people that came to Florida to work in the fields, many of them not from the Caribbean, although a lot of them were, but a lot of them were from places like Georgia and the Carolinas, and still do. You may have heard about 2 weeks ago or about a week ago, there was a horrific crash in North Florida in which a bus struck a semi-truck near Tallahassee and killed 3 people on the bus, plus the driver of the truck. They were all migrant workers for Belle Glade, who live in Belle Glade, Haitian immigrants who had just gone up to Georgia because the harvest was over in Belle Glade, and they were up in Georgia doing back-breaking work planting corn, and we're going to go back to Belle Glade for a week and then go to upstate New York for the harvest there. This is their life. This is 2016. This is not 1928. So they wanted to build an educational center there. Still waiting. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. The question is, why aren't people more upset about Lake Okeechobee's algae bloom and the algae bloom in the estuaries? Well, people are upset about it. Both Florida U.S. senators made sure that they were in front of the cameras, out in front of the algae bloom, the day I was up there. The governor has declared a state of emergency. The problem is that there's a disagreement over what's causing it. And the answer, my kids always joke that Eliot's first rule of politics is that the answer is almost always somewhere in the middle. The answer is that all of those things are causing it. And the question is, which is causing it more, and how do we fix it? What a lot of people want to do is they want to take all that water in the lake, and instead of sending it down those canals where it hits that salt water and creates and takes the algae bloom in the lake. There's an algae bloom in the lake right now. It's about the size of Hialeah. And it's in the lake already. And the lake is one of the most visited tourist spots in Florida. So every person from Indiana who's not coming to fish for bass in the lake is tourism money you're not getting. And this algae bloom is huge. And parts of it are going down the St. Lucie and going down the Caloosahatchee, where they're destroying the economies of Fort Myers and Stewart. What a lot of people want to do is move that algae into a reservoir, buy up some land from U.S. Sugar, create a reservoir, run the water through there, filter it, and then send it down to the Everglades, which, by the way, desperately needs the water. But they don't need contaminated water. You may be familiar with the fact that down here, the Everglades is not doing too well. They need the water. And many, many years ago, somebody got the bright idea to run Alligator Alley and the Tamiami Trail across the Everglades. But nobody stopped to think about the fact that there was a water flow, and if you build these roads, you're going to block the water flow. So that's what a lot of groups want to do. Of course, that costs money. In addition, a lot of people are saying, well, if you finish the repairs to the dike that you've been talking about for 20 years, we won't have to release the water. We can keep the water higher. And I cover the Palm Beach County government, and they've been pressuring the federal government, and the Corps of Engineers says, we can only use the money we get. And Congress is saying, well, a lot of people are asking us for money and asking us, we have a lot of people asking for money for various things. Bill Nelson, the senator, has been pressing for the money to come faster. And so there's a whole issue of who's to blame. Septic tanks north of Lake Okeechobee are contributing. You probably know that the problem with Lake Okeechobee, like when there's a rainfall issue, it's not the rain landing on Lake Okeechobee. You need the rain in the Kissimmee River Valley where it flows into the lake. And there's also a lot of houses and septic tanks and cows and pigs and horses, and all that waste goes into the lake, which is adding to the problem. So it's a combination of a lot of things. And right now, I think a lot of people are more concerned with saying, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. So, other questions or comments? Anybody I left out? Well, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Coming. Behind the counter are available for the books for purchase, and he'll be here signing. For those tuning in online, just call the number on the screen if you'd like us to ship it to you anywhere in the U.S. during the program. Thank you and have a great day.